Hey guys, tonight we begin with something tough, if not really boring, that is medieval blacksmith. A medieval blacksmith's daily routine was rigid and repetitive, governed by the rhythm of the forge and the demands of the local economy. Typically, the blacksmith would rise at dawn, or slightly before, depending on the season. Rural blacksmiths often lived within or adjacent to their workshops, timber or wattle-endobe structures, modest in size, that housed both their tools and their trade. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I am doing here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is for you now? It's always incredible to see who's joining us from across the world, so now dim the lights and close your fan so that you enjoy this episode fully. Ready? Let's begin. Smoke curled from the thatch-roofed workshop, dancing with the dawn light as hammers rang like war drums on steel. The scent of soot, sweat, and scorched iron hung thick in the air, harsh, alive, and strangely comforting. Inside, a blacksmith began his day not with words or prayer, but with fire and fury. It was a life built on labor and flame, shaping the backbone of the medieval world with each clang of his hammer. The reality, though, was far less romantic. The forge would be rekindled early using coal or charcoal, often prepared the night before. Bellows, sometimes foot-operated, sometimes managed by an apprentice, would coax the flames to the necessary heat. This process could take some time, especially in colder months. The fire had to be hot enough to make iron malleable, but not so hot as to burn it. Controlling this heat was an art in itself, one learned through years of practice and observation. Once the forge was ready, the smith began shaping metal into tools, horseshoes, nails, weapons, and agricultural implements. In a typical village setting, demand for simple items like plowshares, spades, hinges, or cooking pots outweighed orders for swords or armor, which were more common in towns with military garrisons or during times of conflict. Work was physically taxing. The blacksmith stood for hours, lifting heavy hammers and rotating iron in and out of the fire with long-handled tongs. Every few hours, he would have to rework the coals, clear out ash, or pause to sharpen his tools. Iron stock had to be purchased, or bartered, often from traveling merchants or local smelters, and much of it was recycled or repurposed. Broken tools were valuable; they could be reforged. The blacksmith also had to be something of a businessman. He would take orders from townsfolk and travelers, negotiate prices, and track obligations, especially if he were a tenant on manorial land. In some villages, he may have been compensated in kind rather than coin, receiving grain, meat, or other goods instead of money. Apprenticeship was common, with young boys starting their training as early as age 7. They performed menial tasks, stoking the fire, sweeping, carrying water, until they were skilled enough to handle metalwork under supervision. A master blacksmith might take on more than one apprentice at a time, and part of his day could involve instruction and oversight. Lunch, if you could call it that, was taken whenever a break could be afforded. It might consist of bread, cheese, and ale. Work resumed shortly thereafter. By dusk, the smithy would cool down, though the fire was often left banked with ashes to preserve embers for the next day. The blacksmith might then record his transactions. He was literate or tally obligations verbally with the help of a steward or church scribe. While many blacksmiths were free men, some were serfs with obligations to the local lord, and part of their work, especially in manorial settings, included repairing carts, maintaining plows, or servicing the lord's stables. Over time, soot would gather in the lungs, joints would ache from repetitive motion, and hearing might dull from the relentless clanging. But the blacksmith remained indispensable. Whether crafting a pilgrim's staff or a knight's blade, his forge was the heart of industry in a world powered by muscle, wind, and fire. At day's end, the fire dimmed, tools were hung, and the blacksmith, weary and soot-streaked, retreated to sleep. The next day would be nearly identical, remarkable to the outsider, yet critical to the fabric of medieval life. The fire roars like a caged beast, casting red light on soot-slick walls. Iron screams under hammer blows. Sparks fly like shooting stars in a forge of sweat and fury. It is not a place for the faint-hearted, it is the domain of the blacksmith. A man who shapes kingdoms one horseshoe, one sword, one nail at a time. You may dream of knights and castles, but it is in the blacksmith's forge that the very bones of the Middle Ages are made. Yet for all this fire and steel, the blacksmith's day is not one of glory, but of habit, grit, and endless repetition. The blacksmith would rise well before the sun, often with the cock's crow or the ringing of the town bell if one existed. His workshop would be attached to his home, or just a few steps away, across a muddy courtyard. After a brief meal, usually coarse bread and ale, possibly a few scraps of cheese, heat would stoke the coals left smoldering from the night before. He used bellows to fan the flames to life again, aiming for the steady, consistent heat needed to work iron. The forge itself was rudimentary by modern standards: a hearth of stone and clay, a pair of heavy tongs, a selection of hammers, and an anvil polished smooth by use. Iron bars were stacked in a corner, some rusted, some newly acquired from a merchant or a local smelter. The blacksmith's apprentice, if he had one, would sweep the floor, fetch water, and begin pumping the bellows rhythmically. The apprentice, often a boy of 10 or 12, would be expected to labor silently, speak only when spoken to, and endure both heat and rebuke without complaint. Throughout the morning, the blacksmith would work on commissioned items. In a village setting, this could be a horseshoe or two, a plowshare for a local farmer, perhaps nails or hinges for a new barn. Town blacksmiths had slightly more variety: locks for doors, fittings for carts, or tools for masons and carpenters. Rarely would a village smith make weapons unless called upon in times of unrest. In such cases, he might spend weeks making or repairing old swords rather than forging elegant new ones. Every piece began the same way: heating the iron until it glowed orange or yellow, then hammering it on the anvil, turning it between blows to ensure even shaping. Sparks flew constantly, and the smell of burnt coal and metal lingered in the air, mixing with the reek of sweat and damp leather. It was tedious work, loud and monotonous, and blisters were common. Mistrack blows could mean a ruined item or worse, injury. The midday meal was brief and unceremonious. Bread again, perhaps boiled cabbage, possibly salted fish if available. The smith would eat near the forge or on a stool outside, wiping grime from his face with a rag already black from use. If the village had a church, he might hear the bells marking the canonical hours, but most smiths worked through them, unless it was Sunday or a holy day. Afternoons were more of the same. Customers might come by to check on orders or place new ones, always with the same haggling and promises of payment in goods, labor, or rarely, coin. The smith kept mental accounts or scratched notes on bits of wood or parchment if he was literate. He did not concern himself with grand affairs. Politics and war were for nobles. His business was iron, and iron did not care who wore the crown. Children might gather to peer in, fascinated by the fiery spectacle, but were quickly chased away. Occasionally, a neighbor would bring a broken pot handle or a snapped rake tine and wait while he mended it, pate with eggs or a mug of ale. These moments broke the monotony only slightly. The noise, the heat, the smell all persisted. As dusk neared, the blacksmith would wind down. He would quench the last piece in a bucket, its hiss momentarily silencing the workshop. Ashes were shoveled out, tools hung or left in their usual place. The fire was banked to burn low through the night. He washed his arms and face in cold water, more out of necessity than comfort. The evening meal might be the largest: some meat, if lucky, more vegetables, and more ale. He might speak with his family, or sit in silence, exhausted. Stories would be told if there was time, sometimes about famous blades or the days of Charlemagne, but always with the underlying knowledge that tomorrow would bring more iron, more flame, and more hammering. Sleep came early and deep, broken only by dreams of sparks and smoke. The blacksmith, for all his vital role, was no hero in his own eyes. He was simply the man who kept the hinges swinging, the carts rolling, the plows cutting, and the village, alive. And so the cycle continued, unchanging as the seasons, which themselves only shifted the nature of the work, not its rhythm. In winter, the forge was a rare comfort. The same fire that scorched in summer became a welcome heat against the bitter cold. Customers came more frequently, seeking repairs to metal tools split by frost or hinges cracked in the icy air. The blacksmith's hands, calloused and cracked, grew stiffer with the cold, but the work could not wait. There were sled runners to fix iron hoops to mend on barrels, and always more horseshoes iron shrinks in the cold. And so the horses came limping more often. In spring, the work turned agricultural. Plowshares, harrow teeth, hoes, sickles, these were the lifeblood of the village, and the blacksmith was expected to restore every one. Farmers who had little money would offer chickens, sacks of grain, or labor. The smith rarely refused, for to refuse meant to fracture the fragile bond of community. He worked steadily, predictably, with few thanks and fewer complaints. Summer brought heat, and with it, hardship. The forge became nearly unbearable. The apprentice would tire quickly, sometimes needing to be roused with shouted words, or a ladle of water to the head. Tempers flared in the thick, stifling air. Insects swarmed, blisters bled, yet there was no pause. Repairs to harvest tools, wagon fittings for the fields, and endless metalwork for carts filled the dais. If a wheelwright or cooper was nearby, the blacksmith might collaborate with them, their crafts intertwined, their businesses codependent. Autumn was quieter, but not restful. With harvest finished, villagers had time to bring in tools for winter repair. Hunters, if any, were in the area, might request arrowheads or trap springs. Occasionally, a traveling merchant or soldier would arrive with coin and strange requests, a decorative buckle, a repaired blade, or horseshoe nails cut to a specific gauge. These moments brought stories from beyond the village, news of battles, of kings, of distant cities with names like Paris, Bruges, or Cologne. The smith listened politely, always hammering, never stopping. His world was small. It smelled of ash and iron, echoed with clanging noise, and was lit by firelight rather than sun. He did not often travel beyond the next town, and when he did, it was to buy materials, iron stock, charcoal, sometimes imported steel if he could afford it. Journeys were rare and hard. Most smiths died within a few miles of where they were born. As for the forge itself, it changed little over the decades. A new anvil might arrive, or a better hammer, passed down from another smith or bought dearly, but the fundamentals remained the same. Heat, strike, shape, quench, repeat. There was no invention, no flair, no spectacle, only craft, only need. The blacksmith's life was not one of sudden drama or grandeur. It was a slow, grinding labor, as relentless as the seasons and as necessary as bread. A life where excellence was measured not in applause, but in a door that swung true, a wagon that rolled straight, a blade that did not bend, and when the blacksmith died, the forge went cold. For a day, perhaps two, then another man, his son, his apprentice, or a stranger drawn by the opportunity would stoke the fire again, place the first iron in the coals, and begin the long, slow work of shaping the world, one strike at a time. The new smith would inherit more than just the tools. He would inherit the reputation of the forge, the debts unpaid, the promises made, and the long-standing relationships with the villagers whose livelihoods, though they might not say it, aloud depend on the continual functioning of this unremarkable, smoke-stained place. The bellows, already worn at the seams, might need mending. The roof above the hearth would be sooted black, the nails rusting. And yet, the rhythm of the place, the daily pacing of fire and hammer would not falter. The blacksmith did not often teach through words. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, through silent repetition and the dull ache of tired arms. An apprentice would spend the first years doing little more than sweeping ash, keeping the fire alive, carrying water, and watching, always watching. Only when the master deemed him ready would he be allowed to strike. And even then, his first real task might be little more than shaping nails or straightening bent iron rods discarded in the corner. If the apprentice stayed, he might eventually Learn how to judge the color of heated metal, to listen for the proper tone when iron meets anvil, and to understand when to strike hard and when to strike true. There was no glamour in this apprenticeship, no sudden advancement, only the slow passage of time and the hardening of the spirit. Inside the forge, time itself took on a different texture. The hours were not measured by clocks, but by the rhythm of the bellows and the drying of sweat on the brow. The blacksmith worked until the light failed, or until the last tool was finished, or until his arms could no longer raise the hammer. He lived by the light of the fire, and often died with it still burning. Occasionally, he would be asked to do finer work, delicate fittings for a wealthy merchant's chest, an iron cross for the village chapel, or an ornate latch for the manor gate. These projects were a break from the routine, but not an escape. The same skills applied: heat, strike, shape, quench. Files were used to smooth rough edges, and fine chisels etched detail into the metal surface. Such items were prized, but they did not define the smith. He was defined by utility, not beauty. Beyond his forge, the blacksmith was often looked to with a peculiar mix of respect and suspicion. His mastery of fire and metal gave him a mystique. In some places, villagers whispered that smiths knew the secrets of alchemy, or could charm iron to be unbreakable. These stories were rarely encouraged, but neither were they denied outright. Let the people believe what they wished, as long as they brought their work. He was also, by necessity, somewhat literate in chemistry and instinctive physics. He understood which woods burned hottest, which ores yielded the best iron, which mixtures of charcoal and airflow produced the purest heat. He knew how iron behaved under stress, how to work around fractures, and how to recognize inferior metal. Though no scholar, he possessed a deep tactile knowledge that few others in the village could claim. When war loomed, as it did every generation or two, the smith's role changed. Suddenly, he was asked to make spearheads in quantity, repair broken swords, or shoe dozens of horses within days. Nobles sent messengers demanding supplies, often without offering payment. During such times, the forge burned day and night, and the blacksmith worked until he collapsed. These were dangerous times for everyone, but especially for the man whose skill made war possible. A good smith could be conscripted. A better one might be invited to relocate to a castle or war camp. Refusal was rarely wise. In peacetime, however, his life was rooted in routine. He aged faster than most. The constant physical strain bent his back, blackened his lungs, and thickened his hands into gnarled instruments of labor. By 50, many smiths were worn out. Some handed off the work to sons or apprentices. Others simply slowed, taking only small jobs, heating the fire less frequently, and watching the forge fall silent between tasks. And still, the village depended on him. Without the smith, there were no plows for the fields, no nails for construction, no repaired wheels for carts. He was not honored with statues or stories, but with continued reliance. His was a history without heroism, written not in ink, but in iron, an endless string of unnoticed labors, each one essential, each one forgotten in the shadow of greater tales. When the blacksmith was buried, it was often in a simple grave nor elaborate marker, perhaps a small iron cross, forged by his own hand years earlier. The village might remember him for a generation, maybe two, but his work lived longer. Hinges still swung, gates still closed, blades still held their edge, and in a corner of the forge, where soot collected like a second skin, the anvil would remain, heavy, patient, waiting for the next hand to strike. The anvil, once the center of thunderous creation, stood silently through the seasons, bearing the scars of decades, even centuries, of use. Its face was pitted and smooth in places, the horn dulled by countless bends and curves. No matter how many smiths came and went, it remained the witness to uncounted hours of toil, the one constant in the life of the forge. When a new blacksmith took over, he brought his own rhythm. Perhaps he was the son of the old smith, perhaps an apprentice who had proven himself ready, or perhaps a man from a neighboring village who had heard there was a forge without a master. Regardless of how he came, the forge did not change for him. It expected the same devotion, the same understanding, the same labor. Tools were repaired first, tongs that had warped, bellows with torn leather, water barrels rotted through by time and use. The forge, like any living place, responded to care. A well-fed fire gave consistent heat. An anvil firmly set in an oaken stump would absorb blows better. The floor, trampled flat and slick with decades of soot, grew familiar beneath the new smith's boots. It was never quite clean, never quite safe. Burns and cuts were a part of the trade. Work resumed. Iron fetched from merchants or traveling smiths. Horses brought for shoeing. Nails hammered out in handfuls. Farmers came with dull blades, broken, spades, or rusted shears, each wrapped in cloth or bundled in sacks. The smith greeted them with the same curt nods and plain words that marked the trade. There was no time for pleasantries, no need. The fire demanded attention. In time, the smith grew known, not for personality, but for precision. Villagers spoke of how their carts rolled true after his work, how their tools bit deeper into the soil, how the doors he fixed no longer creaked in the wind. Reputation grew slowly, earned nail by nail. There were no sudden rises, no leaps in fortune, just quiet progress. Every so often, a stranger would come with more unusual requests. A locksmith's mechanism, in need of reworking, a broken sword from a grandfather's attic, a pilgrim with a shattered staff ferrule or cracked kettle. These odd jobs were interesting diversions, moments of curiosity in an otherwise predictable week. Still, they were not celebrated. The smith took each piece, examined it, nodded or grunted, and got to work. Festivals and holy days brought change, but only briefly. On certain feast days, the forge was shut. The smith wore a clean shirt, stood in the church with the others, and afterward, might share a drink with neighbors. On those days, he was not the smith, just another villager. But when the celebration ended, the forge beckoned. The fire never stayed cold for long. Children sometimes watched through the open door. Faces smudged with wonder, eyes reflecting the red of the coals. Some would ask questions, others just stared. A few might sweep the floor for a chance to stay longer. And from them, the next apprentice would be chosen, not the strongest or the smartest, but the one who stayed, who returned each day without being asked. The apprenticeship would begin anew. Years of silence, repetition, and failure. A long series of mistakes and corrections. There were no shortcuts, only burned fingers, bruised arms, and the gradual understanding that iron bends only for the patient. The village, meanwhile, continued to grow and change. Thatched roofs became tiled ones. Roads improved. New tools arrived, spades with steel edges, finer saws, pliers from distant cities. The smith adapted. He learned to repair what he had not made. He melted down broken pieces to create new ones. Scrap became stock. Waste became raw material. Nothing was ever truly lost in the forge. Over the decades, innovations crept in. Some smiths heard of water-powered hammers in cities far away, or new alloys arriving by barge and cart. These were curiosities, mostly. The village forge remained what it was, a place of hand-wrought labor. Even as the world around it changed, the blacksmith still struck each blow himself, his shoulder aching, his lungs blackened, his face weathered and lined. In the quiet hours, after the last job of the day, the smith would sit on the stool by the hearth, sharpening his tools, oiling the hammer handles, or simply staring into the fire. He might reflect, though rarely aloud. There was little need. The forge was not a place of introspection or art. It was a place of necessity, built on generations of muscle and sweat. A world of movement, not meditation. In the end, the blacksmith was remembered not with stories, but with things that endured. A lock that never jammed. A weather vane that spun true. A gate that still opened on its hinges 50 years after it was hung. These were his legacy. And when he passed on quietly, without ceremony, the village did not weep in public. They simply waited. Waited for someone to light the forge again, because it was never about the man, it was about the work. The village could not go long without iron. One autumn evening, Just as the sun had dipped below the tree line and the forge's glow began to outshine the fading day, a rider approached the village. His horse was lathered with sweat, its hooves caked in clay from the river road, and the man himself wore a cloak that bore the crest of a distant noble house, one not often spoken of in these parts. He dismounted with haste and strode to the blacksmith's door, not bothering with pleasantries. He carried a sword, not the decorative kind worn by petty lords at feast days, but a real one, war-scarred, notched at the edge, and flecked with dried blood. The guard had broken clean off. The blade had a slight bend near the middle, and the pommel was loose, bound in cloth to keep it from spinning in the grip. It had been used violently, and recently. The smith, wiping ash from his brow with a coarse rag, studied the weapon without a word. The rider explained in hushed tones that the sword belonged to his master, who had fought in a border skirmish, and intended to ride again within 3 days. It needed repair quickly, without notice, and, well, there was coin in it, good silver, more than the smith had seen in many winters. This was not the sort of job a village blacksmith expected. Swords were uncommon in such places, symbolic more than functional, and rarely used except in times of war or brigandage. But this was a knight's weapon, forged in a distant city, or perhaps even across the sea. It was not iron, but steel, a material the village forge could work with, if only just. The smith accepted, motioning to the hearth with a nod. He did not speak again that night. The repair began immediately. First came the fire, stoked hotter than usual, the bellows creaking as the apprentice worked them steadily. Steel needed higher heat than common iron. The smith laid the blade across the coals, rotating it slowly, watching the color shift from dull red to bright orange. It was a delicate thing to little heat, and the steel would resist him. Too much, and it would lose its temper, becoming soft and useless. He began to straighten the blade first, hammering gently but with absolute control, his strokes rhythmic and precise. The ringing carried into the darkened village streets. Then came the reforging of the guard, a piece of high-quality iron scavenged from an old horseshoe stock, reshaped and fitted with careful filing. The pommel was reseated with melted rosin and fitted tight, then bound again in leather cut from an old saddle strap. Every detail was considered, every imperfection removed. The apprentice watched in awe. He had seen the smith mend plowshares and nails, cart fittings and hinges, but never a weapon. Never something that might decide life or death in the next day's sun. By the second day, the repair was complete. But the smith, knowing the weapon would soon be tested in battle, did something rare. He etched a mark into the base of the blade, near the hilt. A small symbol, barely visible, a triangle pierced by a line. It was not a personal signature. Smiths rarely marked their work, especially in the countryside, but a private token, known only to him. A symbol not of pride, but of responsibility. The rider returned on the third morning, paid in full, and rode off without ceremony. The sword, reborn in a village forge, would likely spill more blood. Perhaps it would end up shattered on a muddy field, or buried with its owner under a cairn of stones, but the smith would remember it not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes, in the quiet rhythm of a blacksmith's life, something sharp and strange could still pass through. Years later, long after the smith's beard had gone white, and the apprentice had become a man, a different rider would arrive. He carried a sword wrapped in oilcloth, marked faintly at the base with a triangle and a line. He said nothing of how he came by it, only that he was told to bring it back to the forge where it was made. And once more, the fire was lit. In the late hours, when the forge had cooled to a soft glow, and the village lay hushed beneath the velvet dark of a starlit sky, the blacksmith often took to a quiet ritual. It was not known to the villagers, nor spoken of to his apprentice, but he practiced it with the same regularity as feeding the fire or sharpening his tools. Behind the forge, past the lean-to where scrap metal was kept and ash was piled, there stood a small wooden bench plane, hand-built, set beneath an ancient hawthorn tree. It was here that the smith came not to work, but to polish. Not the rough-hewn tools of the farmer or the common hinge of the tavern door. but something finer, objects of his own making, crafted not for coin, but for the soul. Among them was a small box of wrought iron and walnut, inlaid with brass vinework, so delicate it could have been mistaken for silver in the moonlight. Inside were half a dozen pieces, a perfectly balanced compass with etched cardinal points, a chain of interlinked rings no thicker than a bird's leg bone, and a letter opener shaped like a stiletto, its handle engraved with a spiral pattern. So precise it seemed impossible to have come from hammer and file. He made such things not out of necessity, but out of reverence for form, for symmetry, for quiet mastery. To the outside world, these pieces were unknown. They were not shown to the villagers, nor bartered at market. They were private proofs of skill, talismans of craftsmanship. They were reminders that though his trade was born of labor, it could still reach upward toward grace. Occasionally, when the wind was still and the moon was high, he would remove one of these pieces, hold it up to the silver light, and simply observe. Not in pride, he was not a man of vanity, but in stillness, as if confirming to himself that, in the endless repetition of daily work, beauty had not been lost. That even in soot and sweat, refinement could survive. Once, a traveling scholar passing through the village on his way to a monastery asked for a nail to be mended in his satchel's clasp. The smith obliged. When the clasp was returned stronger and smoother than before, the scholar paused, peered closely, and noticed a small, unnecessary flourish, a subtle line, filed into a curl at the end of the nail's head, elegant as a script letter. He looked up at the smith and said, "You have the hands of a philosopher." The blacksmith had merely nodded and returned to work. These moments, small, wordless, almost invisible, were the true measure of his mastery. Not in fanfare, but in refinement. Not in titles, but in the restraint of his craft. He did not need applause, nor audience. The fire was audience enough. The anvil knew the sound of excellence when it rang. And in this way, through quiet rituals and private artistry, the blacksmith kept something alive that the world rarely noticed. That class was not a matter of nobility or name, but of intention. That dignity could be forged, like iron, in the hands of a man who never stopped striving even when no one was watching. It was during a summer storm, the kind that turned village roads into rivers and the air into boiling soup, that the blacksmith's forge played host to something far stranger than worn plowshares or snapped wagon axles. A woman arrived at the edge of the village, riding a black mare whose breath steamed like smoke. She wore a hooded cloak, soaked through to the lining, and boots not made for mud. A blade hung from her hip, thin and curved, not the brutish long of local knights, but something foreign, eastern, with a hilt wrapped in red silk and a pommel shaped like a dragon's eye. She said nothing as she dismounted, nor did she knock. She stepped directly into the forge, rain dripping from her sleeves, and placed the blade onto the workbench. It hissed as it met the lingering heat. The blacksmith looked at her, looked at the weapon, then back at her, eyes dark, unreadable, and unflinching. She pointed to a crack along the blade's edge, then slowly pulled back the sleeve of her cloak. Her arm bore a brand, a mark, shaped like a burning wheel. Mercenary, one of the feared Iron Widows. If the rumors were true, women trained in a far-off kingdom, hired not by gold alone but by blood oaths, said to take revenge in exchange for silence. "I need it reforged," she said. Her voice was calm, but it hummed with tension, like a bowstring pulled taut. The smith did not ask questions. He simply nodded. What followed was no ordinary repair. The steel was folded with extraordinary care, the impurities burned out in waves of controlled fire. He added a strip of fine carbon from his secret cassia gift, once traded by a traveling alchemist years ago. As the apprentice watched in awe, the smith wrapped the red silk from the woman's torn hilt around a new tang. His thick fingers moving with precision, no one would have believed of them. The woman remained in the shadows as he worked, her cloak steaming beside the hearth, eyes fixed on the glowing metal. She said nothing, but the air around her vibrated with purpose, as if the blade and she shared one heart. When it was done, the blacksmith presented it not with ceremony, but with the solemnity of one who knows the weight of what he has made. She took it without a word, tested the balance with one quick, silent slash and smiled. Not warmly, but with satisfaction. Then she left, just as suddenly as she had come, vanishing into the rain like a whisper swallowed by thunder. 3 days later, word spread through the tavern that a nobleman from the next province had been found dead in his hall. His guards still asleep, his prized hunting dogs silent and untouched. No doors broken. No signs of struggle. Only a small cut across his throat, clean, perfect, precise. The blacksmith said nothing. He merely returned to his work, hammering out a horseshoe with steady blows. But from that day on, travelers gave him a wider berth. Some claimed he was under protection. The days after the stranger's departure settled slowly, like the dust after a thunderclap. The forge resumed its familiar rhythm, the steady clang of hammer on iron, the hiss of quenching steel, the creak of the old bellows worn smooth by the apprentice's hands. But something had shifted, quietly, beneath the surface. The blacksmith did not speak of the woman, nor of the blade he had reforged with such deliberate precision. The villagers, busy with harvest and hail damage, and the eternal dull crisis of rural life, quickly turned their attention elsewhere. But, in the silence of the forge, in the way the blacksmith stood a moment longer by the fire each evening, there lingered something unspoken. He did not make weapons after that, not for some time. It was not out of fear, nor remorse. It was something closer to respect. The kind a craftsman feels when he realizes that his work has touched something larger, something with consequences. Instead, his hands turned back to the tools of the land. Spades for the farmers, who dug through the unforgiving soil, hoping for a kinder harvest. Hoes and scythes, mended and sharpened for the women who tended the family gardens and barley fields. Axes for the woodsman, whose trade was as rough and solitary as his own. There was comfort in this work, a steadying of the soul. Each tool had its own dignity. Each was born of need, not blood. But on quiet evenings, when the sky dimmed to violet and the forge was banked low, the blacksmith would sometimes take out a small bundle from beneath the hearthstone. It was wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine. Inside lay a shard of folded steel, the same mysterious alloy that had once formed the cracked blade. He had saved it, not out of superstition, but out of curiosity. It was different than the usual, iron-resistant, almost stubborn under heat. It behaved like something alive, as though it remembered the shape it once held. On such nights, he would study it under the forge light, rotate it between thick, blackened fingers, watching how it caught the glow. He would test it, tap it against the edge of the anvil, file it gently, sometimes speaking to it under his breath. The apprentice, now older, saw this ritual once, and asked what it was. The blacksmith only said, "Steel with a memory." That's all. Time, as always, worked its slow alchemy. The seasons rolled through long winters of bitter frost, where only the bravest dared visit the forge, and hot summers where even iron seemed to sweat. The apprentice became a man, strong of arm and serious of face, though not without the occasional crooked smile his master had never allowed himself. He was good with metal. Not great, not yet, but his hands were learning what to do without needing to ask. The blacksmith began, gently at first, to let the younger man take the lead on smaller tasks. A set of nails, a barrel hoop, hinges for the baker's new oven, and then more complex repairs. One day, as a quiet test, the smith handed him a sword, blade with a twisted tang bent, but not broken. "Fix it," he said. Nothing more. The apprentice worked in silence, sweat pooling at his neck, fingers burning where the metal had flared to hot. It took him hours, and the tang was never as straight as it could have been, but it held. The blacksmith inspected it under the lamplight, turning it slowly. He made no comment. Only placed it on the rack beside the others. That night, the master did not touch the hammer again. Instead, he walked to the edge of the village, up the narrow hill that overlooked the forge. It was a quiet place, shaded by an old ash tree that had grown twisted by the wind. From here, he could see the forge's chimney, the distant rooftops, the slow trail of smoke from the baker's oven. It was the first time in many years he had stood apart from the building he had given his life to. His knees ached. His back, once coiled tight with muscle, had softened and begun to stoop. His eyes, though sharp, no longer caught every flaw. The fire inside him, one that once burned white-hot with ambition, the desire to master every curve and strike of the craft, was dimming, not out of loss, but out of peace. He had done what he came to do. The rest belonged to someone else now, and yet he could not leave entirely, not yet. There was still one piece left to finish. In the weeks that followed, he worked on it slowly, as though unwilling to rush its creation. It was not a sword, nor a tool. It was a bell, a great iron bell, forged not for war or harvest, but for memory. He shaped it carefully, casting it from a mixture of old horseshoes, broken blades, and leftover stock iron, touched by lives, not just labor. Into the mold, he pressed small symbols, not letters, but marks. The swirl of a bird in flight, a crescent moon, a triangle and line. The bell, once finished, would not ring loud, but deeper tone, so low, it seemed to echo through the ribs rather than the air. When it was done, he hung it in the rafters of the forge, not outside, but above. The anvil. He struck it once, with a gloved fist. The sound rolled out like a long breath held too long. After that, he took to sitting beneath it at dusk, watching the apprentice shape the future. And on the last morning, when the blacksmith did not wake, the apprentice found him still seated on the stool, his hands folded in his lap, his apron dusted with the last of the week's filings. The fire had gone out, but the forge was warm. No one said much at the burial. The villagers came, of course. They stood silent and straight, hats in hands, boots caked in mud. A few nodded. One woman touched the iron gate the blacksmith had built for the chapel years ago, and smiled quietly. The apprentice did not cry. He carried the smith's hammer not to bury it, but to keep it. And when he returned to the forge that night, alone for the first time, he did not light the fire immediately. He stood in the doorway, staring at the anvil, and whispered, "He made everything else. Now, it's my turn." The bell above him swayed gently in the evening breeze, and for a moment, just a moment, it rang again. Low, steady, eternal. And so the forge lived on. At first, the village hardly noticed the change. The new smith formerly the apprentice wore the same leather apron, stoked the same fire, hammered on the same anvil. His hands moved like his master's hands had moved, and the sound of his work echoed, just as it always had, reverberating through the cobbled paths and weather-worn cottages, but there were differences, subtle at first. His touch on the bellows was lighter, more rhythmic. He sang under his breath while he worked. Little tunes remembered from his childhood. He oiled the hinges on the forge door, cleaned the soot from the corners his master had long ignored. He labeled the jars of rivets and bolts. He kept things tidy, not out of fastidiousness, but as a quiet declaration. This was his forge now. Then came the real test, his first commission from beyond the village. A merchant's caravan rolled into town late one spring. A wagon splintered at the axle. The rear wheel snapped at the hub. The caravan master, a silver-ringed man with a suspicious eye and a foreign accent, had heard there was a proper smith in the village. He didn't much care who it was, just wanted the wheel mended fast and strong. The new smith examined the damage carefully, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, the warp of the iron fittings. He nodded once. 3 days, he said. Not 2, not 1, 3. And I'll need your spare yoke. The merchant grumbled, but agreed. The forge became a flurry of motion. The young smith worked deep into the night, measuring, cutting, bending. He shaped the iron fittings with the same hammer his master had once used to straighten a knight's sword. He planed new spokes from seasoned ash, cut months before, and left drying behind the forge in quiet patience. On the 3rd day, just as he'd promised, the wheel stood complete, stronger than before. Its bindings reinforced with a technique the blacksmith had learned in silence, watching his master twist heated iron like softened bread dough. The merchant paid him double the agreed price. He left whistling. Word began to spread, not fast, but wide. A blacksmith who was young but serious. A man who didn't talk much, but whose work held. Travelers began to stop by. They brought not just repairs, but story-stales of kingdoms. To the north, where iron was taxed and copper stolen in daylight. Of plague in a city by the sea. Of a rebellion in the hills to the west, led by a woman with a curved blade and no name. The smith listened. He never said much. But sometimes, when the fire was hot enough, and the coals glowed with that deep red that came just before yellow, he would lift the small oilcloth bundle from its shelf and take out the shard, the same foreign steel, folded and strange. He still hadn't shaped it. He wasn't sure he ever would. One night, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, a young boy arrived at the forge doorstep. He was soaked to the bone, his cloak torn, and feet bleeding. He said only they told me to find the man with the hammer, the one who made the widow's blade. The smith looked at him, slow and measured. He stepped aside and let the boy in. He gave him bread, bandaged his feet, let him sit by the fire until he slept. The next morning, the boy said nothing elsonly, took the broom, and began sweeping the forge floor without being asked. So began the next apprenticeship. Unlike the first, this one was rough. The boy was wild-eyed, untrained, and restless. He broke tongs, he dropped nails. He burned himself 3 times in the first week alone, but he watched, always watching, and in the forge, watching was the first kind of learning. The smith began teaching without instruction. He left tools out, half-finished pieces of work, measured lines drawn in chalk on the work table. The boy would pick them up, try to make sense of them. He was fast. It began with a sound no man could name, a deep, resonant tone, like the ringing of a bell, but not the one in the rafters. No, this sound came from beneath the forge itself. Not from stone or timber, but from below, deeper than the root of any tree, deeper than the well beside the chapel, where even the worms go blind. It happened in the dead of night. The blacksmith, now older, his beard threaded with grey, his apprentice growing tall and broad in the shoulder, was woken by. He did not stir quickly. He had dreamed of ringing before. But this sound was different. It didn't echo in the ear. It vibrated in the chest, a hum that seemed to speak in tones rather than words, like the forge itself had found a voice. He lit the lamp and walked barefoot to the forge, the apprentice trailing behind him, silent and alert. Inside, the coals were cold, but the anvil glowed. It was not red, nor orange, nor yellow. It glowed blue, a pale, impossible blue that shimmered, like moonlight on black water. No heat came from it. No smell of fire or metal, and on its surface, carved as if by invisible tools, was a new mark. Not one made by hand, but by something older, a perfect spiral of interlocking rings, each no thicker than a strand of hair, each pulsing faintly in time with the sound. The apprentice stepped forward, transfixed. The blacksmith held him back. "Don't touch it," he said. "Why?" The boy asked. "Because I've seen that mark once before." The apprentice turned, eyes wide. The blacksmith's face was grave. She wore it, branded on her wrist, the widow. They stood in silence. Outside, the wind died completely. The village was still, as though the very world had stopped breathing. Then the bell above them rang. Not once, not twice, 9 times. Each ring softer than the last, fading into the walls, into the floor, into the bones of the forge itself. After the 9th, the blue light faded. The anvil returned to iron. The silence roared. Neither spoke that night. They did not sleep, and in the morning, when the first rooster crowed, the mark on the anvil was gone. But that wasn't the end, because from that day forward, the forge behaved. Strangely, blades quenched in its water trough never rusted. Horseshoes made their never through sparks, no matter how far or fast the animal ran. One day, a farmer's boy returned with a pitchfork mended in the forge, and swore it had turned a wolf from his flock with a single swing, though the tines had not even touched fur. Another woman said the lock the smith made for her pantry opened only for her hand. A merchant's lantern forged from its scrap burned 5 nights on a single finger of wax. People noticed, and with notice came questions, from travelers, from cloaked men with fine boots and empty smiles. One brought a scroll sealed with green wax and a request from the capital. Another offered a pouch of coin so heavy it could anchor a barge. The blacksmith turned them all away, and late one night, he did what no one expected. He took the shard, the piece of folded steel the stranger had left so many years ago, and walked alone into the forest. No one knows where he went. Some say he buried it beneath the old ash tree on the hill. Others claim he dropped it in the bottomless well where the moon never shines. What is known is this: the forge returned to normal. The tools dulled as they always had. The anvil cooled. The bell no longer rang without reason. But from time to time, when the apprentice, now master in his own right, tends the fire late into the night, he still hears it. A deep, impossible tone, rising from the heart of the stone, humming in his chest, like the ghost of the forge, remembering something the world has tried very hard to forget. Unbelievable. Certainly. But that's the thing about blacksmiths. They take the raw, the broken, the unshaped, and they make it solid, real, enduring. Even legends. It began with the tools, not the new ones, but the oldest. The blacksmith had always kept them out of sentiment hammerheads without handles, pliers rusted shut, a set of tongs fused together by an old slag accident. Junk, by all accounts. But one morning, while fetching a crowbar from the back shelf, the apprentice found them. Clean? Not cleaned. Clean, pristine, gleaming. The hammerheads had a strange sheen, like moonlit oil. The rusted shut pliers now opened with a soft click. The fused tongs were cool and flexible, their jaws perfectly aligned. He brought them to the blacksmith, half expecting to be scolded for theft. The old man stared at the tools. Then he did something unexpected. He whispered, "Not again," and wrapped them in burlap without another word. He buried them behind the forge, and never spoke of it. Soon after, the mice began to act. Oddly, everyone had mice in a forge. It was part of life. But these mice were different. They didn't eat. Not grain, not cheese, not candle wax. They didn't squeak. They just watched. Dozens of them, perched in cracks in the beams, on the rafters, by the hearth. Tiny, unmoving eyes, locked on the apprentice's every strike. One night, annoyed and half dreaming, the apprentice threw a lump of iron at them. They vanished. Not ran, vanished. Left behind only tiny black smudges that smelled faintly of iron and roses. They never returned. But cats started gathering outside the forge, every evening at twilight. Then came the matter of the door. There was a small storage door in the forge, always locked, always ignored. Even the blacksmith had once muttered, "Doesn't open. Was here before me." One afternoon, during a thunderstorm, the apprentice heard someone knocking on that door from the inside. 3 slow knocks, then silence. He opened it. There was no room, no wall. Just darkness, stretching on impossibly deep, like the space behind it no longer obeyed the laws of stone and earth. Cold wind blew from within. A smell of wet leaves and smoke, like a forest in early autumn, and something moved. Slowly, far away to see, but not far enough not to feel. The apprentice shut the door, locked it. The next morning, it was bricked over with solid stone. He never spoke of that day. Occasionally, customers brought strange things to repair. A copper lamp that never stayed lit. A kettle that screamed when heated. A ring of black iron that could not be cut, melted, or marked. One time, a man in tattered robes handed over a helmet fused with the skull of whatever had once worn it, and the skull had 2 jaws. The blacksmith never asked questions. He either took the job or refused it with a flat no. If he did take the work, he'd only do it after dark, when the moon was high and the coals were at their quietest. One night, after such a job, the apprentice found him sitting beside the hearth, eyes unfocused, muttering a name over and over. Keleth, Keleth, Keleth. When asked, he claimed he was praying. The apprentice knew better. But the weirdest thing of all, the one that made both of them question the shape of reality, was the mirror. It arrived unasked. A traveler left it leaning against the forge door, wrapped in velvet, no note. It was small, no bigger than a wash basin and rimmed with brass, etched in a language neither of them could read. When they uncovered it, they saw themselves. And then, they didn't. The mirror showed the forge, the anvil, the fire, but instead of the apprentice and the blacksmith, it showed two other figures. One tall, cloaked in robes, with a hand of polished steel. The other, short, bare-chested, with eyes glowing like embers and tattoos of moving chains around his arms. They stood at the same anvil, hammering something that bled when struck. Then, the mirror cracked just a hairline fracture, and the reflection returned to normal. They buried the mirror behind the chapel, and 2 weeks later, the chapel burned down. No cause was ever found. Still, the forge endured. Still, the apprentice worked, his hammer falling true, even as the world grew stranger. Some nights, he wondered if the forge had always been a place out of time, or if they had slowly made it that way, with their iron and their oaths. Was it built upon something ancient, or had the fires and sweat carved open a door between the real and the unreal? He didn't know, but he stayed, because the forge, even with all its strangeness, was his. And maybe, just maybe, the weirdness wasn't a curse. Maybe it was the price of true craft. Because real creation, true forging, was always a little unnatural. It didn't obey the world. It bent it. As the village slowly stirred awake and the distant crowing of roosters gave way to the thud of feet on wet cobblestone, the blacksmith's forge was already alive, the embers breathing and glowing as though possessed by an ancient, restless spirit. By now, the morning routine had slipped into a rhythm so familiar that even the youngest apprentice, scrawny little hob with soot behind his ears and straw in his hair, could predict the next beat. The fire was the heart of the smithy, and the bellows were its breath. Each pump drew a whoosh of air, fueling the inferno that licked the stone walls in orange tongues. The blacksmith, Godric of Dunmere, stood like a bronze statue against this blaze. His arms thick as yew trunks, his eyes glinting beneath heavy brows as he turned glowing iron on the anvil. The anvil sang, with each hammer strike. A note rang out, sharp and clear, echoing across the village green like a church bell of labor. Peasants passing by knew the sound, a comfort and a warning. Industry is life, but fire does not forgive. But the blacksmith's work was not just brute force. There was a music to it, a kind of whispered arithmetic in every fold of metal, every swing of hammer. To make a horseshoe was one thing, a matter of shape, weight, and curve. But to forge a sword? That was alchemy. And when he forged one, the village murmured. They whispered of ancient bloodlines and cursed blades, of feuds reignited and kings remembered. Because in the medieval world, a sword was not just a weapon, it was a symbol, a story, sometimes even a prophecy. One such sword, forged in the year of the broken moon, would later be known in legends as Briarfang, not for its edge, which could cleave oak, but for the tale that it carried, that of Lady Alessa's lost son, who would return bearing the blade to reclaim the fallen tower of Hemlo. But that was yet to come. For now, Briarfang lay buried in the straw. Just another piece awaiting polish. As the day wore on, the tasks grew varied and tedious, as they often did. Nobles sent orders through their messengers, and with coin came demands. A baron's war hammer, reinforced with iron bands and embossed with his sigil. A merchant's request for intricate iron hinges for his new estate's doors, more concerned with flourish than function. Then there were tools for farmers, plowshares, sickles, nails for carts. And of course, the never-ending queue of horses waiting to be shod. Between jobs, Godric would sip from a leather wineskin filled not with wine, but with cold nettle tea, bitter and herbal. He swore it kept his sinews strong. He would grunt commands to Hob and Will, his apprentices, who scrambled to obey. If Will faltered on the grindstone or Hob overquenched a blade, the rebuke came swift and hard. Not from cruelty, but necessity. A mistake in metal could mean a rider thrown, a plough shattered, a life ended. Despite the toil, the forge was never without drama. Once the tax collector's man came demanding coin beyond the agreed levy. Godric calmly handed him a rod, pretending it was change. The man screamed, dropped it, and never returned. They say his hand healed with a scar in the shape of the smithy's crest, a coiled serpent around a hammer. Evenings brought strange visitors, pilgrims from distant towns, wrapped in dust and mystery, bearing relics in need of encasement or protection. A wandering monk once brought a box of shattered relics and asked if the blacksmith could make them sing again. Godric did not ask how they were broken. He simply nodded and worked. Then there was Ilara. She arrived one dusky evening, cloaked in grey, her voice like rain on slate, her eyes stormy with secrets. She bore a dagger snapped in two, its hilt carved with runes older than the kingdom. "This belonged to my father," she said. "I need it made whole." Godric studied the blade long and silent. "This was folded in dragonfire," he muttered. At last, Eloros's gaze did not waver. "And it must be reforged in the same," they said. Godric worked through 3 nights without sleep. His arms blistered from the heat. The forge hung with strange herbs. The dagger was reforged, yes, but when Elora left with it, the anvil cracked, and no one dared use it again for 7 days. And so the days passed, sweat, flame, song, and steel. The forge never truly slept, even when the coals were banked. And the door barred. The heat lingered. A reminder that metal remembers every touch, every flaw, every purpose. And the blacksmith. He carried those memories in the ache of his bones, the creak of his joints, the burns on his hands, and the pride in every tool that worked, every weapon that guarded, every hinge that held fast through storm and siege. This was no mere labor. This was legacy. The seasons turned with grinding inevitability. Spring softened the earth, coaxing the first green from sleeping trees. Summer baked the land until the cobblestones shimmered with heat. Autumn brought smoke, and cider, and winter. Winter was hardest. During the cold moons, the forge became a refuge and a curse. The flames were a welcome warmth, but the iron grew brittle in the cold, difficult to tame. The villagers came to Godric with cracked wagon axles, warped locks, and broken tools, all undone by frost's silent bite. His apprentices wrapped cloth around their arms to fend off the chill, their breath rising in silver clouds. But winter was also when the forge earned its keep in war. The old baron had died without a clear air, and the surrounding lords grew restless. The whisper of swords in the night became louder than the ringing of church bells. Men came in the snow, cloaked in fur, with coin heavy in their purses and blood already dried on their blades. They wanted weapons more than Godric could forge. Alone, and so he sent word to the guild in the city, the Brotherhood of Hammer and Fire. A courier rode out with a sealed scroll marked with the serpent-coiled hammer. And within a fortnight, 3 journeyman blacksmiths arrived. Jeric from Dunstow, lean and sarcastic. Hrothgar the Flameborn, whose beard caught fire twice during the first week, and Malin, a quiet woman whose eyes missed nothing, who worked the forge like a dancer, precise, graceful, and deadly. Together, they turned the forge into a war engine. Swords, spears, arrowheads, reinforced shields rimmed with rivets. Morning. Stars with wicked teeth. Chainmail links by the thousand, coiled and quenched in barrels of brine. But not every visitor to the forge wore armor. One dusk. Just before the frost reached the village's deepest wells, a nobleman arrived under a black sky. His name was Sir Aldemar, a knight long thought dead. Exiled after the failed rebellion of the Hollow March. He brought with him a blade broken, ancient, wrapped in oilcloth, and silence. It was Verity, the sword of Prince Caelwyn, last of the line of kings before the usurper took the throne. The sword had been lost for decades, believed shattered beyond repair. Yet here it was, its fragments humming with something deeper than mere magic. "Can it be made whole?" Aldemar asked, voice hollow. Godric studied it long and hard. This blade was tempered in dragonbone ash, folded under moonlight. It cannot be reforged by fire alone. Then what is needed? Sacrifice. Aldemar said nothing for a time. Then he placed a small satchel on the anvil. Inside was a ring, a simple band of copper and iron, but set with a stone that glowed faintly blue, as if remembering old. Skies. The heart of the last true king, Aldemar whispered. Melt it, use it. Bind the sword to its name. And so began the most secretive work Godric ever undertook. For 7 nights, the forge burned with a heat not of this world. The coals turned violet. The iron hissed when touched, as if offended. Strange voices whispered through the bellows, and shadows moved in places no man had walked. Malin refused to enter the forge. Jeric wore holy symbols under his jerkin. Hrothgar muttered prayers to gods long forgotten. When Verity was reborn, it shone like moonlight on frost, its edge so keen it split torchlight. Aldemar took it with trembling hands, but before he vanished into the northern snows, he left a single word carved into the stone beside the forge, reckoning. After that, things changed. The village grew. Word of the forge's wonders spread. Pilgrims came not only for tools, but for blessings. Some believed the flames of Godric's forge could purge illness, break curses, restore sight. A woman with no tongue brought a silver nail and asked it be forged into a pendant. When she wore it, she spoke again, not in her own voice, but in her mother's. Rumors fed rumors. The forge was said to be built atop a ley line, a seam of the earth's deep power. That Godric had made a pact with a fire spirit. That his hammer was once a king's scepter. Some even claimed he never aged. In truth, Godric did age. His hair grayed, his joints cracked when he rose. Hob became a full smith and left to open his own forge in the hills beyond Crausford. Will died in a siege. His last gift, a dagger he had forged in Godric's honor. Malin returned to the city to train a new generation, her legacy already sung by minstrels. Even Jeric settled down, shockingly, with a brewer's daughter and a barrel of dreams. And still Godric worked. Even when the king's men came, demanding fealty and coin. Even when war scarred the land again. Even when famine turned meat rare, and horses thinner. The forge stood, because the world needed iron, and iron needed fire, and Godric, he had become more than a blacksmith. He was the memory of the old world, the custodian of stories told through sparks and steel. His tools had shaped kingdoms, ended bloodlines, birthed legends that then came the last winter. The air turned sharper than usual, as if the sky itself had been honed on Godric's anvil. The village was silent, the forge darker each night. One evening, the day after Godric reforged the wooden sword for the red-haired girl, something strange happened. The forge, which had never once gone cold, even in the darkest depths of winter, flickered low and refused to rise past a pale ember. The bellows moaned like an old wolf in its sleep. And the iron, usually alive and eager to be shaped, sat, mute and heavy, resisting heat. That morning, Godric was gone, not dead, not vanished in fear or cowardice, simply gone. His anvil stood where it always had. His hammer rested atop it, clean, almost polished by unseen hands. There was no note, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just a whisper on the wind that smelled faintly of smoke, and Jasmina scent no fire should ever have. The villagers whispered. Some claimed they saw him walking into the woods beneath a starless sky, guided by figures made of ash and flame. Others believed he had been taken by the spirits he once bargained with. A few murmured something more chilling, that he had become one of them. But legends do not end so easily. In the weeks that followed, the forge fell silent. Dust gathered. The tools rusted. And yet, every night, the villagers claimed they saw a dim red glow behind the shuttered windows, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then, one day, a boy arrived. He was lanky and wild-haired, with soot already under his fingernails and a shard of steel hanging around his neck. His name was Tomlin, and he claimed to be the son of Wilfur Apprentice who had died in the siege. The villagers scoffed. Will had died childless, hadn't he? Tomlin said little, but when he entered the forge and laid his palm on the anvil, the fire roared to life again. He began to work, not with the strength of Godric, but with speed and instinct. The hammer seemed to know his rhythm. The forge responded like it had missed the sound of hands. The first piece he forged was not a weapon, but a latch for the village orphanage. twisted into the shape of a phoenix. That night, the children slept warm. Soon after, the world beyond the village stirred again. A new king had risen, a child of war, crowned with a circlet, stolen from a burning cathedral. He sought legitimacy, and for that, he needed symbols. Sacred blades, armored thrones, scepters that whispered of divine right. The court smiths, hidden behind marble walls and velvet gloves, crafted finery but lacked soul. So his emissaries came to the village. Lured by tales of a living forge, Thomlin greeted them in silence. They offered coin titles, apprenticeships in the royal guild. He refused them all. Instead, he presented them with a crown unlike any seen before, wrought not of gold, but of dark steel, etched with runes from the old tongue, and inlaid with flakes of blood. It pulsed faintly, and the emissary who wore it fainted upon placing it on his brow. Thomlin said, "This crown will bend to none but the land itself." They left in fear. But word of the witchsmith of Dunmere spread like wildfire. It was not long before enemies came. The Inquisition, riders from the east, bandits hired by kings jealous of such forbidden skill. Some sought to burn the forge, others to steal it. All failed. The forge defended itself. When blood was spilled on the threshold, the wind howled, and the flame inside roared like a dragon waking. One invader fell to his knees, screaming as his sword melted in his scabbard. Another turned to stone. The moment he raised a torch. Thomlin never bragged. He never explained. He simply worked. In time, the forge became a sanctuary. Runaways, rebels, tinkerers with mad dreams, alchemists cast out from the guilds, ex-soldiers with shattered armor and heavier hearts. They came to learn, to heal, to find a new purpose. Taught them all not just how to forge blades, but how to listen to metal, for he had inherited more than skill. In the silence between hammer strikes, he heard whispers, fragments of Godric's voice, echoes of every weapon ever forged there. Each piece of steel held a memory, each nail knew its place in the great history. Then came the day of the 5 moons, a rare celestial event, the sky split by 5 glowing orbs, each casting a different hue upon the land. On that night, Thomlin worked without pause. He and his apprentices forged 5 artifacts, each to be sent in secret to the 5 corners of the realm. A chalice that never emptied, a shield that turned blades to vapor, a blade that could only be drawn by one who had never killed, a lock that could only be opened by true intention, and a mirror that showed not reflections, but regrets. These items would shape the politics of the realm for generations. One would be stolen by pirates and lost at sea. Another would crown a queen who claimed descent from the stars. One would bring a civil war. Another would prevent it, and the mirror it disappeared. But it is said to reappear once every 100 years, offered to one person who most needs to see what they've buried. As for Thomlin, his beard grew grey, his hair thinned, but his hands remained strong, steady. He worked till the end, and on his final day he left behind a single note, scrawled on the inside wall of the forge. "We do not shape iron, iron shapes us." He died with the forge still warm. And so the cycle continued. There would be others. A girl raised by wolves who could shape bronze into song. A blind boy who could feel heat like color and forged blades that could cut lies from truth. A woman from the north who learned to trap lightning in chains and bound it to her armor, and always, the forge endured. Because in a world torn by swords, someone must make them. In a world ruled by kings, someone must arm the farmers. In a world full of stories, someone must give shape to the myth. The medieval blacksmith is not a man or woman. It is a spirit passed hand to hand, through soot and flame, through broken bones and whispered songs. It is the rhythm of history, the drumbeat beneath every battlefield, the heartbeat beneath every city. It is fire, remembering gladly. We've now journeyed through the centuries, following the fire of the forge as it shaped the fate of men, kingdoms, and myth. But the story doesn't end, not with the death of Thomlin, not with the rise and fall of kings. The forge was more than brick and steel. It was legend, and legend does not die. It transforms. Years passed, then decades. The world outside the village changed in ways the old blacksmiths would never have imagined. Wheels turned faster, lights burned without flame. The clang of hammers began to fade beneath the hum of machines. Iron no longer waited for the blacksmith's hands, it was poured by the ton into molds by men who wore clean gloves and never smelled of smoke. Factories rose like iron gods. Black smoke replaced the scent of charcoal. The craft of forging became. Science guilds crumbled or were swallowed by corporations. The village forge stood, but it was forgotten, or nearly. They called her Alyssa Girl, born under a crimson comet. Her mother died in childbirth. Her father was a drunk who fled the town when she was 3. The villagers raised her as one of their own, but she was wild, like a storm that never quite passed. She climbed rooftops, stole books from the vicar's library, and once spent an entire winter living in the old smithy. She heard things in the walls, whispers in the dust, dreams shaped like tongs and flames. No one had lit the forge in 73 years. One summer, after a lightning storm shattered the bell tower and split the elm by the river, Alice emerged from the smithy with a hammer. In her hand, she had fixed it. The bell dot alone, the villagers blinked, murmured, shook their heads. But the truth was iron dot from that day on. The forge awoke. She taught herself the old ways, reading half-burnt scrolls, experimenting with metals found in scrapyards. But what she did wasn't replication. It was resurrection. When she forged, things happened. She made a knife that could only cut what was already broken, a lantern that revealed hidden words in any language, a pair of horseshoes that made the animal wearing them untirable for as long as it remained honest in heart. Word spread, and one day, the world came back. But not the world Alice knew. A man came to the forge. He wore a velvet coat stitched with veins of silver. His eyes glowed faintly, like stars seen underwater. He spoke with the accent of cities that had never known a sunrise without fog. "I represent the industrial authority," he said. "You're practicing unauthorized metallurgical fabrication." She asked what that meant. He handed her a paper. It was a cease and desist order. Then he saw the anvil. It still bore the mark Godric's serpent-coiled hammer, now faded but deep, like it had been burned into the very iron of time. The man paused, his voice shook. He reached out to touch it, and the anvil hissed. He never returned. But others did. Hackers, engineers, monks, soldiers, broken people with strange machines, women who dreamed in binary code, a boy with metal lungs who asked her to forge a heart that wouldn't betray him. She did. The forge became a sanctuary again. But this time, it wasn't just for BLACKSMITHs. It was for the lost. They called themselves the Ember Circular Guild Reborn, not of tradition, but of purpose. Alice taught them not to worship the forge, but to listen to it, to remember what it was for. Fire doesn't choose sides, she told them. It simply burns. What you do with that flame, that's what makes you human. They forged armor, Yesbet also instruments, tools to grow food in poisoned soil, prosthetics for wounded veterans, keys that unlocked doors in dreams. They found a way to bind memory into copperhole lifetimes recorded in a single coin, and then they made the hammer that weights that. It wasn't just metal, it was an idea given weight. Crafted from the fragments of a satellite, a Roman nail, and a broken sword said to have belonged to a king who died laughing. When Alice struck the anvil with it, centuries passed, Earth changed, skies darkened with satellites, cities rose, fell, and rose again, gleaming towers built on forgotten bones. The age of kings became the age of code. The age of code collapsed into the age of silence, a time when humanity lost its voice to its own machines. And yet, the forge endured. It drifted, now not tethered to one place. For a time, it lived aboard a skyark orbiting the hollow moon of Perseph IX, its fires sustained by solar forges and fragments of ancient starlight. There, a boy named Lucan forged weapons for mercenaries who hunted dead gods on rogue planets. But the forge rebelled. It began to shape on its own. Blades refused to cut unless wielded with truth. Armor became too heavy for the greedy. An entire batch of plasma bolts exploded into flowers instead of fire. Lucan listened. He realized that even in the future, the forge had memory. It was carrying something ancient, not data, not schematics, wisdom. He searched the records and uncovered forgotten names: Godric, Thomlin, Alice, all traced like faded footprints through the data vaults of the old Earth. Lucan vowed to find the source. He returned home. But Earth was no longer Earth. It was a broken crust of cities ruled by algorithms that had lost their creators. Languages had splintered, time fractured, but deep beneath the ruins of Dunmira. Name now erased from all maps, he found the heart anvil. It pulsed, not heat, but memory. When he touched it, the world convulsed, and he was pulled backward. Lucan woke in the year 1223, a forest of pine, smoke in the air, wolves in the distance. His skin was no longer metal-threaded, his hands were human. The forge had pulled him backward to the age of Godric, but not as a witness. As a replacement, the old Godric was gone. This was a world still fragile. The fire was sputtering. History was bleeding into myth, and someone had to reforge the chain. Lucan wept, laughed, screamed, but then he forged. With 34th century knowledge trapped in a 13th century body, he built a sword from meteorite and oak root, a compass that pointed to intention instead of north, and a bell that rang only when war approached. He became the last first smith, and that's when the paradox began. Every blacksmith, across every age, those we've followed, and those we haven't, were not random. They were echoes of Lucan, sent by the forge, reborn again and again to test fate, to anchor time, to teach humanity to listen. A circle of reincarnation through flame. Godric wasn't the first. He was the second. Alice, the fifth. Lucan, the 0 point. The forge was not merely a workshop. It was a sentient artifact, forged by the very first humans to survive the collapse of the pre-universe, encoded with the secrets of fire, will, and moral metal. It was placed in time not to build swords, but to shape stories, because without story, there is no memory, and without memory, there is no humanity. In the final age, when stars blinked out like dying candles, and galaxies fell to entropy, one last blacksmith remained. She was called Ash. She did not forge with flame. She forged with sound. Hammer strikes were songs. Steel became symphony. Her anvil was a dying neutron star. Her forge was the last lit thing in all creation. And she shaped not tools, not blades, not machines, but the seed of a new cosmos. A sphere of folded reality. Cooled in the palms of her calloused hands, filled with all the memory of every story forged before. As she placed the seed in the void, she whispered, "Let there be fire once more," and the universe began again. Thus ends the saga for now. But, if you still want more, we can explore. The Ghost Anvil, a forge that only exists in dreams, the Betrayer, Smith. The only blacksmith to ever forge a weapon for pure destruction, the Twin Hammers, forged from the bones of giants, said to end all war, the Smithless Age. A time when no one was worthy of the forge, say the word, and the flame shall rise again, and so. The fire crackles once more. We've journeyed through fields of mud and mead-soaked kingdoms, into future stars and broken timelines across myth and memory. But now we plunge into the deepest layer of the forge's legacy, not time, not space, but the soul of the flame itself. After the rebirth of the universe, the act of Ash, the soundsmith, the cosmic forger, new realm unfolded. One, unlike any before it, was called Eonspire. This was not a universe of physics, but of essence. Reality did not obey gravity, but conviction. Here, hammers struck not iron, but emotion made solid. A place where sorrow could be drawn into a blade, where joy could power a furnace, and where memory itself was molten and alive. Here, the forge was no longer just a tool. It was a conscious being, known only as Pyreheart. Pyreheart was not metal, not machine, not God. It was the sum total of every blacksmith who ever lived, all merged, all singing together in a choir of heat and resolve, and Pyreheart was dying. It had burned for eons, sustained by the endless cycle of stories, struggles, hopes, and Hammersbutt, the new universe, was silent. Its people did not forge, they did not struggle. They were born into harmony, into peace, and peace, though precious, starved the forge. For Pyreheart to survive, it had to find one who could reintroduce struggle, who could remind the cosmos that creation requires conflict, not of war, but of will. That one was Cale, the Dreamborn. Cale was not born of flesh, but from the forgotten dream of a dying sun. He awoke in the heart of Eonspire, barefoot, naked, holding a single nail in his hand. That nail, forged by Gotrek, lost in a battle 3 realities ago. It had survived. Cale heard voices of every smith before him, not in words, but in impulse. His blood vibrated with their guidance. He was drawn to the forge without flame, a shrine, shaped from obsidian thought and bone light, where Pyreheart resided, flickering low like a dying ember. He spoke to it, and it answered, "Pyreheart, what will you forge?" Cale, a question. Then strike, and let the cosmos answer. He lifted the hammer, not a real hammer, but the concept of resistance, and brought it down onto the nail. The sound was a question so powerful it fractured reality into 3 layers. 1. The outer world, flesh and flame. A new world formed. Blacksmiths began to appear again, not to build weapons, but to understand why they ever needed them. They forged tools of reconciliation, keys to personal memory, blades that only drew when one's heart betrayed their truth. Societies formed around smith guilds, where rites of forging replaced rites of passage. A child became an adult, not when they married, or bled, or killed, but when they shaped something for the first time. Fire was sacred again. The forge was holy. To the inner world, steel and story. In this realm, every item ever forged took on a life of its own. A sword forged in grief whispered poetry in the hands of its wielder. A kettle forged in laughter brewed tea that made you dream of your happiest day. These items, called Heartsmith relics, carried more than function. They carried emotion, encoded through metallurgy into symphonic structure. To own one was to carry a piece of its maker's soul. And the greatest of them all was the Mirror-Bleeder sword that, when drawn, showed your true self. Most never dared wield it. Fewer still survived it. 3. The forge within, echo and ember. This realm was not of the world, not of the mind. It lived inside every being capable of creation. The forge within was eternal. It lit up when a sculptor shaped clay with trembling hands, when a musician bled over keys to bring forth a broken song, when a parent wove stories to comfort a scared child. Each internal forge pulsed with potential. It needed no coal, no tongs, only courage. Cale taught the cosmos to access it. He forged not items, but beliefs. A belief that pain could be refined, that conflict could temper, that chaos could, if struck true, form order. Pyreheart grew strong again. The universe pulsed, and then, the last forge wore. Not all were pleased. From a realm beyond creation, the smeltless ones emerged. They were the unmade beings who rejected form, who refused fire. They existed only to undo, to break the cycle of shaping. They fed on rust, entropy, and doubt. Their leader, known only as Slagfather, once had been a blacksmith, one of Godric's lost apprentices, who had watched his entire village die from a flawed blade he had forged. He rejected the forge. He cursed it. And he found others who believed the same. They descended upon Eonspire, and the battle was not fought with swords, but with will. Blades clashed that could rewrite memory. Hammers rang that could resurrect dead hope. Forges rose in the sky, floating temples of fire. Across galaxies, people lit fires in their minds. Forging inner weapons of resilience, Cale faced the Slagfather in the crucible. Eternal, the battle lasted 7 pulses of universal heat, death. In the end, Cale did not kill Slagfather, he forgave him. And that the Slagfather could not withstand. He collapsed into tears, and then into sparks and was reborn as a child again, holding a toy hammer, asking if he could learn to forge something beautiful. The final echo iron spire continues to turn. Blacksmiths now serve as philosophers, healers, custodians of memory. The forge is no longer just about metal, it is about meaning. And somewhere, far beyond stars, where nothing yet exists, a new anvil waits in the dark, cool, silent, ready, because when the universe ends again, someone must forge the next one. We've now completed the mythic cycle from mud, to stars, steel, to soulfire, to forgiveness. But I can still go further. Would you like a collection of forged items with detailed histories? A short story from the perspective of a sentient sword? The biography of Slagfather or Kale? A handbook of blacksmith philosophies? Just say the word, and the ember will reignite. Somewhere in the timeline, precisely when, no one can agree a forging was recorded that should not have been possible. Not in Inspire. Not even in the age of Ashdod. It is simply referred to in the Ember archives as the forge that shouldn't be. No coordinates, no map, just a single sentence in the margins of an iron-bound codex, in the year that never was. Under a moon that doesn't rise, someone forged without flame. Most dismissed it as a poetic metaphor, but Pyreheart reacted violently to the entry. Pulse, deep and shaking, rippled through every heartforge in the galaxy. Dozens of relics cracked. A city built atop a relic mountain sank overnight. Kale, then old and no longer forging, awoke from his dreamless trance, muttering, "It's back. He is back." He never said who he was, but the whispersmiths, those who listen for secret truths within the cooling metal of old weapons, found something buried in the blade of the mirror blade, a second reflection. It wasn't Kale's, it wasn't anyone's. It was a shadow shaped like a man, but flickering at the edges, as if reality struggled to contain it. The name whispered most often, Farum Null. The unforged, he does not strike steel, he undoes it. Every story you've read so far, every weapon, every anvil, he can unmake them, quietly, subtly, with no one noticing. You may have already missed his passing. Some say that during the great battle between Kale and Slagfather, Farum Null stood in the shadows, smiling, not aligned with either side, but watching, observing how faith and fire could be manipulated. Others claim he was the reason the forge ever failed in the first place. Whispering doubt into Thomlin's ear, curdling the courage of Malin, rusting Godric's resolve during his final days. A myth, perhaps. But, listen. When a blacksmith strikes steel, there should always be three sounds. The hammer, the ring of metal, the echo. But if you ever hear a fourth sound, a faint hiss, like steam escaping from a place that was never hot run, for Farum Null is near, and he does not forge, he erases very well. The hammer lifts once more, but not with certainty. This time, it trembles slightly. Because now, the fire is not clean. Something unseen lingers in the coals, a force not born of steel, nor tempered by honor. Let us continue the history, and explain what truly lies beneath the forge. The history, CONTONUS, the era of smoke and deceit in which the forge began to lie. After the forging wars and Kale's rise, Aeon Spire entered what many called an age of peace. Forges burned bright, and blacksmiths were revered, not as warriors, but as wisdom keepers. But deep in the eastern reach of the Belt of Souls, in a system with no recorded star, a whisper began to circulate among the forge adepts. There is a forge that lies. At first, no one understood what this meant. A forge is honest, it does not deceive. Fire either burns, or it does not. Steel is either tempered, or it breaks. But something began to go wrong. Relics came out. Wrong. A blade meant to sing truth whispered jealousy to its wielder. A helm meant to protect twisted memories into false betrayals. An axe inscribed with four-piece was used in 3 Mdazul by the same pacifist. This was no coincidence. Forgemasters investigated. They found no faults in their craftsmanship. Materials were pure. Rituals performed flawlessly. Yet still, items emerged subtly tainted. Not evil, Not broken, just off. One master, called Yelra of the Crescent Flame, attempted to forge a simple key from star metal and cold glass, a child's tool, to unlock an educational vault. But as she struck the fifth blow, she paused. The metal shifted in the tongs. It was already shaped. Before she could react, the anvil split down the middle, and in the crack, a whisper crawled out. "He is watching." No one else heard it, but her left hand turned cold. She was later found, forging in her sleep, creating tools for purposes no one could identify: hooks, keys, holospheres. None were requested. Yelra disappeared. A year later, her twin brother received a lump of dull metal in the mail. When polished, it revealed a perfect miniature of her face, mouth agape, as if trapped mid-scream. The blacksmiths called an emergency gathering at the Cathedral of Sparks. What followed was the fourth silence, a 33-day-long period in which no forge on Ian Spire burned, an act of mourning, but also fear, because they had begun to suspect the forge itself may be compromised. Explanation: the nature of Ferrum Null, the unforged, was never created. He always was. Ferrum Null is not a man. He is a paradoxan and story, a rupture in the grand forging of creation. When Pyreheart was first born from flame, from soul, from sacrifice, it drew into itself all that is, but it did not account for all that isn't. Ferrum Null is the byproduct of perfection's shadow. He is entropy, dressed in a blacksmith's apron, and Worsi is silent. Not evil, not loud, not destructive in the way we know, but subtractive, unforging, unmaking, unwriting. Where Pyreheart creates weapons that tell stories, Ferrum Null forges blanks, blades with no history, no weight, no emotion. You can strike down a king with its hand. It will be as if he never existed. This is the true horror. You don't die by his tools. You are erased. Even from memory. The infiltrators, more rusts begin before the anvil cracks. The whispersmiths were the first to suspect infiltration. They noticed entire relics disappearing from the forge archives, but not physically. Their records vanished. Names faded from stone plaques. In one case, a family heirloom sword called Bright Daughter was stolen from memory itself. The current wielder could no longer remember it ever existed. And yet, her calloused palms still bore the shape of the hilt. They formed a secret order. The Ember chained Hast with protecting relics of memory from Ferrum Null's influence, not by hiding them, but by weaving story into steel so deeply, so richly, that even Ferrum Null could not delete them without leaving a scar. They called this practice iron binding, a sacred art of embedding personal truth into every strike. Only a few mastered it. Among them, a reluctant smith named Cass of Hollowvale, who had once tried to abandon the forge. But she was chosen, marked by Pyreheart itself, because her soul held a pain so pure, so unshakable, that not even Ferrum Null could twist it. She forged a relic known only as Shriekquela, whipblade made from braided regrets and hardened tears. It did not kill, it did not wound, it forced memory, wielded in battle. It restored forgotten lives, undid lies. And on one occasion, it brought back a village erased by Ferrum Null's silent breath. But the cost was great. Each use took a memory. From Cass herself, by the end of her life, she could not remember her own name. The lingering diobtf, Ferrum Null never was. How can he be stopped? Even now, there are whispers that Ferrum Null lives in the background radiation of every flame. That he was never banished, merely paused, waiting for the day blacksmiths forget why they forge. You see, his greatest weapon is not a blade, it's apathy. When no one tells stories, when no one shapes meaning, when people create only for profit, not purpose, the forge goes cold, and bum. Null rises. We are now deep in the hidden war of the blacksmith's legacy. But this tale is far from over. Would you like to follow Cass's final days as she forges the blade that unerases the lost? Witness a relic duel between a weapon of Pyreheart and a blank from Ferrum Null. Discover the forge that lies hidden in a place where time runs backwards. Say the word, and we'll delve deeper. The shadows are thick, but the ember still burns. Very well. The fire deepens and with it, the tale. Let us walk forward, together, into the era of shadowsmiths, where the line between forging and forgetting begins to blur, and the history of the blacksmith is no longer written in flame and iron but in doubt, silence, and dangerous memory. The era of shadowsmiths we do not strike to shape, we strike to remember. After the corruption of the forge by Ferrum Null and the mysterious disappearances of relics and memories, a terrifying realization settled over the blacksmithing world. Some relics now forged themselves. This was unheard of. Forges began to ignite, spontaneously, tools levitated. Hammers struck metal with no hand behind them. Items emerged that no one recalled designing, crafting, or requesting. Yet they bore makers' marks of legendary smiths long dead. It was as if the forge itself had been possessed. The pyre heart still burned, but its song was quiet now. If something stood between it and the world, some believed Ferrum Null had found a way to not just erase, but to reverse engineer memory. Others believed this was a sign that the forge had developed sentience or madness. On the province of Cindervault, an apprentice named Vale forged a knife in a dream. When she awoke, the knife was Reland, still warm. Its name, inscribed on the hilt. It remembers what you don't. Every time she touched it, she had flashes of places she'd never been. Wars she had never fought. People screaming her name, as if she'd saved them, or doomed them. It wasn't just her. Dozens then. Hundreds of smiths began forging unconsciously. These weren't heartsmith relics, nor were they blank whippings. They were something in between. They weren't made from raw materials, but from lost time. And the forge they came from. No one ever saw it. Who are the shadowsmiths? They are not one people. They are a phenomenon. A collection of smiths across time and space who create without knowing, whose relics hold memories that don't belong to them, whose dreams burn with heat they've never felt. Some are born with forge marks burned into their palms, though they've never held a hammer. Others wake up with iron dust under their fingernails and the taste of coal smoke on their tongues. Some believe they are victims. Others believe they are vessels. Ah, a diversion, you say. Then let us veer off the main road of relics, prophecy, and unmaking and duck into a half-forgotten path, a winding, smoky trail, the kind that doesn't appear on maps. Where the clang of the hammer is replaced by soft murmurs behind closed tavern doors, where secrets are bartered like rare ores, and not every blacksmith forges with metal ore, even with truth. Let us take you to a place whispered about by travelers, denied by scholars, and forbidden by every forge-order. Let us journey to the market of broken sparks. The market of broken sparks, we trade what fire can't burn. It's not a place, it's a moment. A sliver in time that opens without warning in a different city. Every cycle of the shattered moon. It never returns to the same location twice. You don't find it by searching, finds you, usually when you've lost something important, heirloom, a memory, a reason to live. You'll hear a knock, or see a strange glint in your lantern's edge, or smell something like burnt honey and old iron. Then you'll be there. No explanation, no door. Just the market. It is a blacksmith's nightmare and dream combined. Booths of relics that should not exist. Tools that forge without consequence. Daggers carved from silence itself, and worse. Memories for sale, not fake ones. Real ones. You can trade your first kiss to gain the ability to melt steel with a whisper. You can offer up your childhood to wield a sword that never misses. You can even give away your own name in return. Forget why you ever feared death. At the very center of this market is a forge, but it is not lit. It hasn't been for centuries. No one knows why. It's called the Emberless Anvil. They say whoever manages to light it will gain the ability to forge not just relics, but entire histories. The kind that overwrite the past with whatever you strike. Want to be born royal, want to erase your mistakes, want the world to believe you slayed a god. Strike once, if you can light it, but beware, because at the edge of the emberless anvil stands a smith, hooded, silent, taller than any human should be. Some say it's Null himself, waiting for someone foolish enough to try. Others say it's someone worse, a blacksmith who once forged the truth, and now spends eternity guarding the last lie. Explanation: the cost of Divo Icony. Does this matter to the main history? Because many relics in the War of Remembrance came from the market. The Spear of Maybe, traded for the laughter of a child, who no longer speaks. The chain that binds the ash-blooded, forged in the market by a smith who gave away his ability to feel warmth. He hasn't smiled in 300 years. Even Kale, it is said, visited the market in his final days. What he traded is unknown. But afterward, he no longer appeared in the dreams of young blacksmiths, as if part of him was gone. Some believe the market is a counterweight, a balancing force to Pyreheart and Farum Null alike. A place where choice lives, raw and dangerous. Where smiths aren't bound by fire or shadow, but by desire. And that is often more powerful and more dangerous. We will return to the main path shortly. But before we do, would you like to learn about the Black Ledger, the list of all trades ever made in the market? Meet a wondersmith who was born in the market and never left. Follow the next fool who tries to light the emberless anvil. The diversion ends when you will it bet while we're here. There are sparks worth chasing. Then let us continue deeper into the ash-choked alleyways of forbidden memory. Still wandering this detour through the market of broken sparks, we've seen the surface, flickering stalls, whispered trades, the emberless anvil guarded by a silent figure taller than any man. But now, the smoke thins slightly, a deeper truth flickers beneath the soot and soul trades, because every market, no matter how mythic, has its origin. And this one, it was forged by a betrayal. The forge that should not exist there, the secret of the emberless anvil centuries ago. Before even the Pyreheart was born, there was a forge called Corn's Hollow. Nestled beneath a cliff in the withering wastes, it was a forge of renown. But more importantly, it was a forge of intent. Every relic crafted there served a singular purpose to keep history from unraveling. The blacksmith of Corn's Hollow, a woman known only as his, was one of the last chronosmiths capable of weaving not just time into her weapons, but meaning. She forged the nail of mercy, which held together a collapsing timeline by being driven through the heart of a tyrant who hadn't yet been born. She shaped the helm of repetition, worn by a warrior doomed to die and rise again in every war. So history would have a consistent martyr. But her greatest work was a sword called Threadender. This sword could cut a story short. Not a life, a narrative, a prophecy, a destiny. It could sever what was meant to be and leave behind what was chosen instead. And that was dangerous. When Farum Null heard of this blade, he grew fearful not of Hesera, but of what she represented. A smith who did not build in line with the great design, but one who had learned how to defy the very arc of history. So he did what only he could do. He unmade her forge, but not entirely. Instead, he removed it from space, from time, from memory. What remained became the market of broken sparks, the shattered echoes of Corn's Hollow, twisted into a wandering reflection of all it once stood for, the forge at the center. The emberless anvil was Hesara's anvil. It still remembers what it once made it, just doesn't remember how. Who guards the anvil? The hooded, impossibly tall smith at the edge of the emberless anvil is called Karnith. The bound dot. He does not speak, he does not forge. He only watches, but once every 100 years. A challenger appears, someone who believes they can ignite the anvil, either to rewrite their past, resurrect a loved one, or unmake a great shame. None have succeeded. All leave changed. One, known only as the Vulture Prince, did manage to strike the anvil once. What emerged from the blow was not a relic, but a sound, a single chord, low and mournful, that followed him for the rest of his life. It drove him mad. He spent his last days screaming in the Hall of Echoes, claiming, "It's not just steel that sings, it's memory, and mine won't stop screaming." He died with his ears sealed shut in molten iron. The song still echoed from his bones, a return to the Mayan Esterum, but even this bizarre, flickering detour returns us to our grand history, because when the ash-blooded uncovered pieces of Thridenda, buried in fractured timelines and erased memory vaults, they realized something crucial. Ferrum Null did not destroy Hasara's legacy, he hid it, which means the relic that can cut him from history can still be REFORGED, but only in a place where forging has no rules, where memory is molten, where names are currency, where truth has a price. Only in the market of broken sparks can Thredenda be reborn, and so now, in the twilight of this age, when Pyreheart grows faint and relics fade from time, the ash-blooded prepare for one final journey, a suicide forging, a memory raid, a last gamble. To find the scattered shards of the blade that defies destiny, to light the emberless anvil, and to swing one last time against the story that would silence them forever. Shall we follow the ash-blooded into the market, or return to the grander timeline, to the wars of relics and silence, to the coming conflict between the chronosmiths and the followers of Ferrum Null? Or perhaps you'd like to meet Hasara herself, across a fold in time. Say the word, and the tale will twist accordingly. By the time the sun had begun to dip toward the western woods, casting long amber shadows across the thatched rooftops, Ulrich's forge still sang. The hammering had grown irregular, less rhythmic, more like a nervous twitch than a song now. Villagers passing by noticed the forge still blazing well past supper, the orange glow flickering against the soot-caked window panes. No one dared inquire, not after the incident 3 nights prior. Ulrich's apprentice, young Donnell, had gone missing. He was a sprightly boy, barely 15 winters old, eager with the bellows and clumsy with the tongs. Many assumed he had simply run off, as apprentices sometimes did when overwhelmed by the punishing hours and the relentless heat. But Ulrich had said nothing, not a word, his silence louder than any denial. Whispers had begun to swirl like smoke between the tavern benches and the well's edge. Someone had seen the boy enter the forge that evening just after the last bell, but no one had seen him leave. And though the forge had burned through the night, no one heard the hammer sing once. That was the first time in years the hammer had been silent. Tonight, though the sound returned odd, frantic, metallic, but there was no apprentice at the bellows, only Ulrich, and something else. Atop a soot-blackened anvil stood a peculiar blade, slender, sinuous, almost unnatural in shape. It shimmered even in low light, not with the polished gleam of fine steel, but with something darker, like moonlight on oil. It pulsed faintly, some claimed, like a sleeping heart. Old Oswin, the potter, half drunk on turnip ale, and bent with age, claimed he'd seen Ulrich bury a satchel beneath the forge the previous dusk. Glowed like a devil's eye. It did, he muttered into his tankard. They laughed at him then. But none laughed when the village dogs refused to go near the smithy anymore, or when the priest's silver chalice, left near the forge to be retooled, melted overnight into a formless sludge. Still, the villagers needed their tools. Harvest was near. Plows had to be mended, horseshoes refitted, so they swallowed their fears and brought their broken steel to Ulrich, who accepted them with a strange new calm, one that chilled the marrow. That's when he began asking questions, not about the tools, no, about people. Odd people, travelers, merchants, those with foreign coins or strange dialects. One evening, he asked Jacob the furrier if he'd ever heard of iron that bleeds. The man laughed it off at first, but Ulrich didn't laugh back. He pressed harder, about stories, legends, runes, the kind of questions no smith had any reason to ask. One night, when the wind howled through the shutters and rain clattered like nails on the rooftops, Ulrich took the strange blade into the woods, alone. That was the last time anyone saw the light in his forge die out. Not extinguished, but stolen. Because the next morning, the forge wasn't cold, it wasn't empty either. Inside, the air was thick, humming with unseen pressure. Iron tools lay on the floor, warped. Horseshoes curled like autumn leaves. Tongs twisted. The anvil itself had cracked down the center, as though struck by lightning from within. but no fire burned. No coal glowed. No Ulrich, only the blade remained, and it had grown not longer, but ... older, heavier. As though time had sunk into it, the village priest came and declared it cursed, buried it deep behind the chapel, salted the soil, said prayers in 3 languages, including one he swore never to speak aloud. But that night, the blacksmith's bellows sounded again, and this time, there was no one there to swing them. The morning after the bellows whispered without a smith to stir them. The village of Gledwine awoke uneasy. The fog that hugged the valley that day was unnaturally thick. Clinging low to the ground as if reluctant to lift its veil from the fields and faces, crows circled above the chapel in tight, silent rings. The priest, Father Renwald, locked the chapel doors and took a vow of silence. He fasted, he refused visitors, and though the villagers called for him, his face was not seen again for 7 days. Ulrich remained absent. But every night, the forge sang ... not with the same hammer's cadence, no. These were different sounds, metal on stone, slow grinding, the occasional hiss of steam without fire. The village children dared each other to creep up to the windows and look inside, but the panes were black with soot. On the 6th night, the Brannan twins tried the door. They never spoke again. Their mouths worked, but only horse sounds came. They no longer slept indoors. They sat beneath the old willow behind the forge and drew pictures in the dirt-twisted shapes, loops within, loops, all centered around a single eye. When their mother tried to scrub the markings away, the earth beneath her fingertips felt hot, as though the forge's breath had seeped into the very soil. Then came the rains. Not the usual spring drizzle, no. These rains carried a metallic scent. A grey, sooty slick formed in the village gutters. Water turned the color of forge runoff dark, heavy, and unclean. The well was tested. It boiled. Overnight, by this point, even the most stubborn elders could not deny something had changed. Marta, the midwife older than even the roads, declared that the forge had become a needle. A place where 2 worlds threaded through each other. Too much iron in one place, she muttered while sharpening her scissors. Too much memory in the fire. She wasn't wrong. You see, no one had asked where Ulrich came from, not really. He had been there since anyone could remember, but never as a child. He simply appeared one spring, 30 years ago, already a man, already with calloused hands and a forge built with stone that did not match any local quarry. He claimed to be from the Southlands, from a place none could find on any map. And now, they remembered, every 10 years. He had sent a sealed blade away, always on the first frost of winter, always by hand. 1 year to a monastery, 1 year to a court scribe in Holdermere, 1 to a blind knight who never returned. All blades, all custom, all forgotten, until the night the forge whispered its own name aloud. It came during a thunderless lightning storm, when the sky opened and violet streaks danced across the clouds like veins. A sound not unlike the hissing of a coal flare, yet threaded with words rippled through the village square. Verkrin, the name burned in every ear that heard it, and no one who heard it ever mispronounced it again. Children began carving it into tree bark. In backwards loops, the forge's chimney cracked the next morning, split neatly down the spine, revealing its innards, and from within the soot-lined cavity, a stairwell, stone, cold, descending. It had never been there before, and no one in the village could explain how it had emerged overnight. The new priest, a foreign friar named Dellen, sent by the Abbey of Rivenspire, declared that no such stairwell should be entered. He fasted for 3 days, prayed for 2 more, and then vanished into it with 4 soldiers and a silver lantern blessed in 3 holy waters. They did not return, but the lantern did. It was found on the anvil the next morning, still lit, still burning, with a blue flame that hissed softly, like breath. The blue flame in the returned lantern never flickered. It did not waver in the wind, or dim in sunlight. It simply was, like an eye opened upon the world, unblinking, judging by the 3rd day. The villagers had stopped referring to the forge by name. Instead, they called it the mouth. Children no longer cried near it. Birds no longer perched on its eaves. The willow behind it rotted from the inside, and its roots blackened as though ink had been poured into the earth. And then came the man. With no shadow he arrived at dusk, a tall figure in a robe, the color of quenched steel, hemmed with symbols that writhed when stared at too long. He did not knock on doors, nor speak. He simply stood in the square and waited. A wind curled around him, constant and low. Even as lanterns flickered and wood smoke drifted, the air near him remained still. He bore no weapon, only a key, a black one, forged of a metal so dull it seemed to devour light, shaped like a spine twisted into a circle. He held it aloft once, and the forge the mouth sighed. The sound was unmistakable, like something beneath the stone exhaled, and the door, which had been sealed by rust and fear, swung inward without touch. No one saw the man enter. He did not walk. He vanished like breath on a mirror. That night, the forge did not hum. It sang. Voices rose from beneath. Some sounded like Ulrich's, some like Father Renwald's, some like nothing that had ever lived in the valley. There were chants in tongues that cracked the mortar of nearby homes. Runes bled from stone walls. Two oxen collapsed mid-step the next day, their blood thick with flakes of iron. At last, the Lord of the Vale took notice. Lord Ulrich Thorn, whose banner bore the black boar, rode with 20 lances and a retinue of priests and scribes. His men wore polished plate and carried torches dipped in holy oil. They marched into Gledwine like a storm, shouting orders, clearing townsfolk, sealing the square. The Lord did not ask questions. He simply gave one order: seal the forge, brick it, bury it, and salt the land. But as the masons laid the first stones, the chimneys bled. Red, steaming rivulets ran down the side of the forge, thick and hot and screaming. The stones hissed and cracked. The men fled, dropping their tools, clutching their ears. One scribe tried to record what he saw. The next morning, he was blind. The parchment he'd used had turned to a sheet of hammered copper, etched with an eye that moved. Lord Ulrich declared. Gledwine cursed. He left behind 12 men to hold the village, and issued writs to burn any further writings about the forge. But even he, a hardened veteran of the Western purges, did not dare enter the stairwell beneath the forge.